A racist teacher crossed the line when she poured super glue on a black girl's hair. But when the girl's father walked into the school, the teacher's life turned into a nightmare she never saw coming. This story will leave you speechless and questioning how far a parent will go for justice. Zora Williams stood in front of her bedroom mirror, gently touching her natural curls. After years of painful straightening treatments, she had finally found the courage to wear her hair the way it grew from her scalp. Today was her first day at Westlake Middle School, and despite the butterflies in her stomach, she felt beautiful. "You look perfect," her father Marcus said, appearing in the doorway. "Your mother would be so proud." Zora smiled at the mention of her mother, who had passed away 2 years ago. It was her mother who had always encouraged Zora to embrace her natural beauty, even when Zora begged for the chemical straighteners that would make her hair look more like the white girls at her old school. As Zora walked through the halls of Westlake Middle School, she couldn't help but notice she was one of only a handful of black students. The town had a long history of segregation that lingered in invisible ways, even 50 years after integration. In Ms. Reynolds' art class, Zora sat straight-backed and eager, her colorful pencil case neatly arranged on her desk. Ms. Reynolds, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair pulled into a tight bun, scanned the classroom with practiced authority. When her eyes landed on Zora, something shifted in her expression, so subtle that most wouldn't notice, but Zora felt it immediately. "Today we're creating self-portraits," Ms. Reynolds announced, walking between the rows of desks. When she reached Zora, she paused. "Your hair is quite voluminous. Make sure it doesn't block anyone's view." A few students snickered. Zora's cheeks burned, but she nodded politely. Throughout the class, Ms. Reynolds found reasons to correct Zora's work. "Your lines are too thick. That color is too bold. Your workspace is untidy." Each comment seemed aimed at making Zora smaller, less visible. As the class progressed to a demonstration on mixed media, Ms. Reynolds stood beside Zora's desk, holding various art supplies. "This is fabric glue," she explained, showing a small bottle. "And this is super glue, which you must be very careful with." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Ms. Reynolds' hand tilted, the bottle of super glue tipping directly over Zora's desk. The clear liquid poured out, flowing toward Zora's arm and splashing onto her hair. "Oh!" Ms. Reynolds exclaimed, making no move to stop the flow until several seconds had passed. "These things happen." The class fell silent as Zora froze, feeling the cool liquid seeping into her curls. She raised her hand to touch her hair, and her fingers stuck instantly. "Ms. Reynolds," Zora whispered, panic rising in her throat. "I think it's in my hair." Ms. Reynolds sighed as if Zora had created an inconvenience. "Go to the nurse, she'll help you clean up." In the school bathroom, the nurse examined Zora's hair with growing concern. "Honey, I'm so sorry," she said gently. "Superglue doesn't wash out. We'll need to cut these sections." Tears welled in Zora's eyes as she looked at the clumps of hair now permanently fused together. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and called her father. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Something happened at school." 30 minutes later, Marcus Williams strode through the school doors, his face a mask of controlled anger. What Ms. Reynolds didn't know as she sat smugly in the principal's office was that Marcus wasn't just any concerned parent. He was a civil rights attorney who had recently returned to his hometown with one specific mission: to address the school district's long history of discrimination against students of color. And Ms. Reynolds had just given him his first case. Principal Gaines fidgeted with his tie as Marcus Williams sat across from him, the silence in the office growing heavier by the second. Between them, Ms. Reynolds perched on the edge of her chair, arms crossed defensively over her chest. "Mr. Williams," Principal Gaines finally said, "I understand you're upset, but I assure you this was just an unfortunate accident. These things happen in art class." Marcus's jaw tightened. 25 years had passed, but the dismissive tone was eerily familiar. The same tone used when he'd reported racial slurs carved into his locker as a student at this very school. An accident, Marcus repeated, his voice level but charged with emotion. My daughter has lost chunks of her hair, hair that took years to grow, hair that is deeply connected to her identity and self-esteem. Ms. Reynolds cleared her throat. I don't see why this is being made into such a big issue. I've apologized already. As she spoke, Marcus was transported back to his sophomore year. He was 15 again, sitting in this same office while his football coach explained away the prank where teammates had hung a noose in his locker. Boys will be boys, the principal had said then. That moment had set Marcus on his path to becoming a civil rights attorney. Where is my daughter now? Marcus asked, pulling himself back to the present. The nurse is with her, Principal Gaines replied. We've called a hairstylist who specializes in African-American hair to come help minimize the damage. How considerate, Marcus said, his sarcasm barely contained. And this is the first incident of this kind? The principal and Ms. Reynolds exchanged a quick glance that didn't go unnoticed. Of course, Ms. Reynolds said too quickly. I've been teaching for 27 years without complaints. Later, in the nurse's office, Marcus held Zora's hand as she stared at the floor, her shoulders slumped. The nurse, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Patterson, worked gently to separate the strands of hair that could be saved. Dad, I just want to go home, Zora whispered. I don't want to make a big deal about this. This is already a big deal, sweetheart, Marcus said softly. When Zora stepped out to use the restroom, Ms. Patterson closed the door and lowered her voice. Mr. Williams, there's something you should know. This isn't the first time Ms. Reynolds has had an accident involving a black student's hair. Marcus's breath caught. What? Last year, a girl named Tiana had her braids cut during a lesson on symmetry. Ms. Reynolds claimed Tiana gave permission, but the girl was in tears for days. Her family complained, but nothing came of it. Why didn't the school take action? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Ms. Patterson's eyes darted to the door. This school has a way of burying certain problems. That evening, Marcus made calls to families he knew in the community. Each conversation revealed more incidents. A black boy kept from the school play because his diction wasn't clear enough. A girl who received detention for wearing traditional African head wraps. Cultural projects that mysteriously received lower grades. At home, Zora stood before her mirror, tears streaming down her face as she assessed the damage. Several patches of hair had been cut close to her scalp, leaving her once proud crown uneven and broken. Maybe I should just straighten what's left, she said when Marcus appeared behind her. Or get a wig. Zora, Marcus began, his heart breaking for his daughter. The other kids were laughing, Dad. Not just white kids. Everyone. Her voice cracked. I don't want to be the girl who gets teachers in trouble. I just want to fit in. The next day, Principal Gaines called with an offer. Ms. Reynolds would make a private apology. Zora could transfer to another art class, and the school would pay for professional hair treatments to repair the damage. We want to resolve this amicably, the principal said. No need for this to become a public matter. Meanwhile, the community had already begun to divide. Marcus received supportive calls from some parents, both black and white, expressing outrage over the incident. Others defended Ms. Reynolds, suggesting Marcus was playing the race card over an accident. At the grocery store, Marcus overheard two white women talking. That Williams man is trying to ruin a good teacher's career over spilled glue. Everything's racial these days. Later that week, Ms. Reynolds gave an interview to the local paper, casting herself as the victim. I've dedicated my life to teaching all children, she said, tears in her eyes. Now my reputation is being destroyed because a parent is making an accident into a racial issue. As the controversy grew, Zora became more withdrawn. She began wearing beanies to cover her hair and asked to stay home from school. Everyone's staring at me, she told Marcus. Can't we just accept the apology and move on? Marcus sat at his desk late into the night, surrounded by notes and records he'd gathered. The pattern was clear. Decades of discriminatory incidents, all buried by administrators eager to maintain the school's reputation. His legal instincts told him this was a case that could force real change. But each time he looked at Zora, curled up on the couch with her hoodie pulled tight over her head, doubt crept in. Was pursuing justice worth putting his daughter through a public battle? Would forcing the school to confront its racist past help heal Zora's wounds or deepen them? The deadline to accept the school's offer loomed. Marcus had to decide. Take the private apology and let Zora try to move on, or fight a system that had been hurting children like his daughter, and like himself, for generations. Marcus declined the school's offer, requesting a 2-week extension instead. If he was going to make this decision, he needed all the facts. His investigation began at the county library's archives, where he pored over old newspapers and school board minutes. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. Ms. Reynolds wasn't just any teacher. She was the granddaughter of Harold Reynolds, a school board member who had vehemently opposed integration in the 1960s, once famously declaring he'd close the schools before letting them mix. This can't be coincidence, Marcus whispered to himself. Through former colleagues and school staff who spoke on condition of anonymity, Marcus gathered evidence of at least 7 formal complaints against Ms. Reynolds over her 15 years at Westlake. All involved students of color, and all had been dismissed or buried. At home, Zora was showing small signs of healing. Though still reluctant to return to school, she had joined an online support group for black girls navigating predominantly white schools. "Dad, whatever you decide, I trust you," she told him one evening. "But I should have a say too." Marcus nodded, realizing he had been so focused on fighting the system that he'd nearly forgotten to include his daughter in her own story. "You're right," he said. "This isn't just my battle." Together, they crafted a response to the school. They would meet with Ms. Reynolds, Principal Gaines, and Superintendent Foster to discuss a resolution, but Zora would attend too. The meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus arranged his evidence meticulously in a leather portfolio, while Zora wrote and rewrote what she wanted to say, her hands trembling slightly. "You don't have to do this," Marcus assured her. Zora squared her shoulders. "I know, but I want to." When they entered the conference room, the tension was palpable. Ms. Reynolds sat with her arms crossed, eyes darting nervously. Principal Gaines fidgeted with his pen. Superintendent Foster, a stern woman in her 60s who had flown in specifically for this meeting, eyed Marcus warily. "Thank you for agreeing to this discussion," Marcus began, his voice calm and measured. "I believe we all want what's best for the students of Westlake Middle School." Ms. Reynolds visibly relaxed, clearly expecting the emotional outburst she had prepared for. Marcus noted this reaction, then methodically opened his portfolio. "Before we discuss specific remedies for what happened to my daughter, I think it's important to understand the context." He slid a document across the table. "This is a record of complaints filed against Ms. Reynolds over the past 15 years, all involving students of color." Principal Gaines reached for the paper, but Superintendent Foster intercepted it. "Mr. Williams, where did you obtain these confidential records?" she demanded. "They were provided by concerned staff members," Marcus replied evenly. "People who care about the well-being of all students." He continued, placing another document on the table. "This is a photograph from 1965, showing Harold Reynolds addressing the school board in opposition to integration." He looked directly at Ms. Reynolds. "Your grandfather, if I'm not mistaken." Ms. Reynolds' face flushed. "What my grandfather believed has nothing to do with me." "Perhaps not consciously," Marcus acknowledged. "But our family histories shape us in ways we don't always recognize." For the next 30 minutes, Marcus presented his evidence without accusation or anger, just facts, patterns, and historical context. He showed how the school had systematically overlooked behaviors that harmed students of color, how casual racism had been normalized, and how Ms. Reynolds fit into that larger picture. As he spoke, Ms. Reynolds' defiance gradually crumbled. Her eyes grew distant, then troubled, as if seeing her own behavior through a new lens. "I've always prided myself on treating all students equally," she finally said, her voice unsteady. I don't see color, I just see children. That's part of the problem, Marcus replied gently. When you say you don't see color, you're saying you don't see my daughter's identity, her culture, her experiences. You're erasing a fundamental part of who she is. Ms. Reynolds' eyes widened slightly. I thought that was the right thing to say, she admitted. Many people do, Marcus acknowledged. But it's a misconception that allows subtle biases to go unchecked. Superintendent Foster, sensing the conversation moving away from legal liability, interjected. Mr. Williams, we appreciate your thorough research, but we need to focus on resolving this specific incident. She pulled out a document. We're prepared to offer compensation for the hair damage, emotional distress, and future therapy if needed. In exchange, we ask for a non-disclosure agreement. Marcus smiled slightly. I'm not interested in money or silence, Superintendent Foster. Then what do you want? Principal Gaines asked, clearly confused. Change, Marcus said simply. He pulled out a final document, a comprehensive plan he and Zora had developed together. This outlines a path forward. Mandatory cultural competency training for all staff. Curriculum updates to include diverse perspectives, a student-led diversity council, and a community reconciliation process to address the school's history honestly. The room fell silent as the administrators skimmed the proposal. This is extensive, Superintendent Foster said carefully. And necessary, Marcus replied. He turned to Zora, who had been silent until now. My daughter would like to speak. Zora straightened in her chair, her voice quiet but steady. Before this happened, I was excited about coming to this school. I spent years being ashamed of my natural hair because it wasn't like the other girls. When I finally started loving it, it felt like freedom. She touched the uneven spots hidden beneath her carefully arranged headscarf. When the glue poured on my hair, and you just dismissed it, Ms. Reynolds, it wasn't just about my hair. It felt like you were saying I didn't matter as much as the other kids. Like my pain wasn't real. Ms. Reynolds' eyes filled with tears. I don't think you're a monster, Zora continued. But I think you don't see how your actions hurt people like me. And that hurts almost as much as doing it on purpose. Ms. Reynolds' composure finally broke. She reached for a tissue, her hands shaking. I never meant, she began, then stopped herself. No, that's not right. It doesn't matter what I meant. What matters is what happened. She looked directly at Zora for perhaps the first time. I'm truly sorry for what I did to you. Not just the glue, but for making you feel less than. You deserve better from your teachers. The words hung in the air, imperfect, halting, but the first genuine acknowledgement of harm. Superintendent Foster cleared her throat. Mr. Williams, I'll need time to review your proposal with the board. Some elements may not be feasible, but... She paused, looking at Zora's dignified face. I believe we can work toward something meaningful. As they left the meeting, Zora walked taller than she had in weeks. Nothing was resolved yet. No guarantees had been made. But something had shifted. In the room, in Ms. Reynolds and in Zora herself. Did I do okay? She asked her father. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. You did more than okay. You opened a door that's been closed for a very long time. For the first time since the incident, they both felt something that had been missing. Not just anger or determination, but hope. Fragile, cautious hope that real change might be possible. The weeks following the meeting brought changes, both expected and surprising. The school board announced that Ms. Reynolds would be placed on administrative leave while undergoing cultural competency training. The news spread quickly through the community, causing a fresh wave of debate. They're ruining a good teacher's career over an accident, some parents complained. It's about time someone was held accountable, others responded. Ms. Reynolds herself cycled through emotions, from initial resentment at being punished for political correctness, to grudging participation in the training sessions, to moments of genuine reflection as she began to recognize patterns in her thinking she'd never questioned before. The school board approved most of Marcus's proposals, though with enough hesitation To make clear, their concern was more about public relations than genuine commitment to change. Still, it was a start. Zora's return to school was its own kind of battlefield. Her hair, now cut into a short, stylish afro that exposed the patches, still growing back, made her feel simultaneously bold and vulnerable. Some students stared, others whispered. But something unexpected happened too. Support emerged from corners Zora hadn't anticipated. Ms. Daniels, a black English teacher who had mostly kept to herself, started a student group called Cultural Bridges. What happened to Zora exposed a problem that's been hiding in plain sight for too long, she told the first meeting. It's time we talk about it openly. To Zora's surprise, the group wasn't just black students. Aiden, a white boy from her math class, showed up. My grandparents would be mad if they knew I was here, he admitted. But what happened to you wasn't right. I want to help. Meanwhile, Marcus joined forces with other parents, some black, some white, some Latino, forming a coalition to address the district's long history of inequity. They began reviewing discipline records, testing data, and resource allocation, building a case for systemic reform. We're not just putting a bandage on one incident, Marcus explained at a community meeting. We're treating the underlying disease. Not everyone was receptive. Anonymous complaints accused him of stirring up trouble. Some parents pulled their children from committee events, but others joined the cause, creating momentum that couldn't be easily dismissed. For Zora, the most profound change was internal. During a Cultural Bridges meeting, she found herself sharing her story. Not just the glue incident, but the years of feeling ashamed of her natural hair, of trying to fit in by erasing parts of herself. I used to think being strong meant staying quiet and not making waves, she told the group, her voice growing steadier with each word. Now I know that speaking up is its own kind of strength. Her words encouraged others. Tiana, the girl whose braids had been cut the previous year, shared her story publicly for the first time. 2 Latino students described being punished for speaking Spanish in the hallways. The stories poured out. Years of small and large injustices finally given voice. For Marcus, watching his daughter find her power was healing in ways he hadn't anticipated. Coming back to this town, to this school, was like facing my own ghosts, he told a colleague. But seeing Zora stand up for herself, it's helping me too. 3 months after the incident, signs of change were visible throughout Westlake Middle School. New books appeared in the library, reflecting diverse experiences and histories. Teachers attended weekly training sessions, some reluctantly, others with growing engagement. The student council now included representatives from all demographic groups. It wasn't perfect, change never is, but it was movement in the right direction. When Ms. Reynolds returned from her leave, she requested a meeting with Zora and Marcus. The tension in the room was palpable, but different from before. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said, her usual defensiveness replaced with something more thoughtful. I realized I've been teaching the same way for 30 years because that's how I was taught. I never questioned whether it worked for all students. She looked directly at Zora. I'm sorry for what I did to you. Not just the glue incident, but for making you feel unwelcome in my classroom. You deserve better. She didn't ask for forgiveness or try to justify her actions. It was a genuine acknowledgement of harm, the beginning of accountability, not the end. On a bright spring morning, as Zora's hair had grown enough to form small, defined curls, Marcus helped her style it before school. It's getting stronger, he said, gently working oil into her scalp. Like me, Zora replied with a small smile. You've always been strong, Marcus told her. Now you know it too. As they finished, Zora grew contemplative. Dad, do you think anything's really changed? At school? Sometimes it feels like we did all this work, and some things are still the same. Marcus considered the question carefully. Change isn't always dramatic, especially when you're dismantling systems that have existed for generations. It happens, in small shifts, in conversations that wouldn't have happened before, in people questioning things they once accepted without thought. He turned Zora toward the mirror. Look at your hair. It didn't heal overnight. It's growing back slowly, unevenly sometimes. But it is growing back. That's how justice works too. Zora touched her curls, nodding slowly. It's worth it though, right? Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, Marcus affirmed. The things most worth fighting for usually are. As they headed to the car, Zora walked with a confidence that hadn't been there before. The work wasn't finished, at school, in the community, or within themselves. The road to true equity would be long and imperfect, but they had refused to accept injustice, had insisted on being seen and heard, and in doing so, had changed something fundamental. Sometimes, that's where real transformation begins, not in grand revolutions, but in one person saying, "This matters. I matter, and I will not be silent." What would you do if you were in Marcus's position?